As the time, we'll come back to our conversation about the necessity or otherwise of NHS staff to have that jab. But let's reflect on the front page of a couple of the newspapers I mentioned when we went through, the Daily Mail and the Daily Express, the idea to really crack on with those Brexit freedoms. And indeed, the Prime Minister has an article in one of those papers today in which he says Brexit helped us bounce back from COVID. Now we'll go faster with our freedoms. Here to explain a little bit more, hopefully, is Conservative MP and Chief Secretary of the Treasury, Simon Clarke. What sort of freedoms do you imagine the Prime Minister is speaking about? Good morning.
Good morning, Nick. Well, the Brexit Freedoms Bill is our attempt to accelerate the benefits of having left the European Union, which I'm obviously delighted that we did. And it reflects the fact that under the bridging arrangements, now that we've left, a lot of EU retained law is still there. That law has a special status. It is given precedence over our domestic law, and it's also harder to amend than our domestic law because it requires primary legislation for any changes, no matter how minor or technical. So the bill that we're bringing forward ends that, and that will allow us to take new action to better reflect our own priorities, because bear in mind, much of that EU law didn't reflect British priorities. Some of it was actually imposed against our will. And so in areas like, for example, data management, you think about the very cumbersome GDPR rules we got from the EU, or financial services, or potentially agriculture for areas like gene editing, where we want to improve yields from farming. These are the kind of things where we will be able to strike our own more proportionate rules going forward. That's what this bill will unlock.
You talk about accelerating benefits, so obviously there are some that you can point to now. In the last 2 years, how have we benefited from having Brexited?
Well, I think that the biggest single benefit came in the form of the vaccination programme, where we were able to use our domestic regulation system to act more quickly in terms of both procuring vaccines, but also then getting them safely licensed for use than the EU. But it's also the case that we've been able to introduce a raft of free trade deals, over 70 of them, including the headline ones with Australia and New Zealand, and the fact we've opened negotiations with India, which is an enormous trade market, the fact we've been able to scrap EU freedom of movement and have our own Australia-style points-based system. That's a huge step forward. But it's also then that we've been able to get rid of some of the more ludicrous red tapes, things like the tampon tax, which we've been able to scrap, or the fact we've been able to reform alcohol duty. These are examples of Britain being able to do things better on our own. That's why we left the EU.
So the highlight of all of that then, Mr. Clarke, is the fact that 155,698 people sadly died in this country of COVID, and that saved your Brexit deal, really, isn't it? Because without that, you wouldn't have much to point to.
I think, obviously...
Well, what else are you going to... You're not seriously going to tell me that this the freedom of movement... You're not seriously going to pretend that we have control of our borders, are you?
Well, we've reformed our legal migration system. We all know that the most robust possible action is needed against the...
I don't have to take you to Dover to point out.
The challenge of tackling illegal migration is at the absolute top of the government's in-tray. And believe you me, no one feels more strongly than I do, Nick, about the need to get control of the channel. And the Prime Minister has been crystal clear about that. But it doesn't get around the fact that we have scrapped EU free movement. And that is something we could not have done as a member state. It's one of the reasons
you certainly scrapped free movement as regards... I'm sorry to talk over you, sir. You certainly scrapped free movement as regards Dover docks. It can take 5 hours now for a lorry driver to get through Dover. That's an improvement, is it? That's, quote, a benefit, is it?
We continue to make sure that our borders flow as quickly as possible, and obviously...
Well, 5 hours... Mr. Clarke, please don't treat me as an idiot. A 5-hour delay is not being treated as quick as fast as possible, is it?
Well,
is that what the good people of Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland voted for? Truck drivers stuck for 5 hours.
They voted overwhelmingly to leave the European Union, something which I fully support and respect. And the reality is that we continue to work to refine our border processes so it can be as smooth as possible. Some of those decisions, and of course this is what we're working on in the context of the Northern Ireland Protocol, reflect the stance of the European Union, which we of course don't control. They have been less than helpful on a number of issues. That is why we're having to work very hard on issues like the protocol so we can try and unlock a more sensible and proportionate approach. We obviously want to have a constructive and successful trading relationship with them going forward. But we should also be clear, we were told by Labour, by all of those people who opposed our decision to respect the referendum result, that Brexit would be a disaster for this country. In reality, it's allowed quicker vaccination, it's allowed us to scrap free movement, it's allowed us to begin free trade negotiations, it's allowed us to get rid of a load of red tape. It has been a big success already, and I'm confident it will be a much bigger success over the years to come as we continue to deepen our diversions.
You do note the pressures at Dover Docks, don't you? You're not ignoring those.
Yeah, no, of course. And look, there was always a balance of advantage and disadvantage to leaving the European Union. There were always going to be some challenges, but the net effect, I am absolutely clear, has been positive, and that this new legislation we're bringing forward today will allow us to go further.
And have we resolved the Northern Ireland issue as regards trade? How is that handled now?
Well, that is being led by the Foreign Secretary, who's been very clear, including in interviews just this weekend, that the EU is going to need to come closer towards us if we're to reach a satisfactory solution on this.
That's another benefit, is it, Mr. Clarke?
All we want
We've got the Northern Ireland situation, we've got blocked over docks, and these are just some of the benefits, Mr. Clarke.
All we want to see is as frictionless a relationship as possible for goods flowing within our country, and let's be clear, that is the case within the sovereign territory of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. We want that to be compatible with a good relationship with the European Union. But if they take an overly legalistic and procedural approach to some of these questions, then they're going to have to be revisited, and that is the prerogative of an independent country.
Just on a couple of other matters, are you supportive of the staying with the hike in national insurance in a couple of months' time, Chief Secretary?
Yes, and the reason for that is the dire backlog that we've got in NHS waiting lists as a result of the COVID pandemic. There won't be a single listener to this show, Nick, who doesn't know someone who's been affected by those backlogs. And the dedicated measures that we're putting in place to raise the money for 9 million more scans, checks and operations are the responsible way to pay for this. And what I do not want to do is to do what the opposition would do, which is to whack all the cost on the national debt, which is just taxes deferred for the next generation. We can't run a country like that. We have to be honest with people that if you're going to spend more on the health service, you do have to pay for it. We've gone through an emergency, and we have to get it right now.
I understand it's worth, and you'll know figures far better than I do, but around £12 billion if we stay with this.
A year, yes.
Per annum, absolutely. Why don't you chase the £5 billion that was fraudulently taken as part of the COVID packages and furloughs and start-up and bounce-backs, and has been, I read, written off?
Yeah, well, you read that, but it's not true. HMRC reserve the right, and quite rightly, will pursue anybody who has fraudulently approached any of these support schemes.
But they've all bought their villas in Tuscany or wherever the hell they buy their villas, Rio de Janeiro, I've no idea. But the money's gone whenever.
Anyone who thinks that they can escape the long arm of HMRC is making a grave mistake. We've set up a £100 million task force to look at this. We've already retrieved 536 million last year. We anticipate that over the coming years we'll retrieve at least another billion, and we will pursue, quite rightly, anyone who has taken public money for the wrong purposes. It is absolutely and totally indefensible. I mean, to be clear, we had to get support money out quickly because we needed to make sure the economy didn't have a collective heart attack in the face of COVID. That was the right thing to do. But equally, we will now pursue anybody who has taken this money fraudulently, and I would urge anyone who's taken that money and didn't really need it to make contact with HMRC now, because the consequences of staying stum will not be good.
Okay. Do you think in hindsight there could have been better checks made, Chief Secretary, that wouldn't have allowed people to set up, I read, fraudulent companies almost overnight and race off with the cash?
Well, we had to strike the right balance when we're introducing this scheme between speed and those checks. And a lot of those checks were introduced very quickly as the scheme was stood up. But if we'd waited to establish all of those protocols until we started the scheme, then we would have run the very serious risk that it wouldn't have kicked in until such time as millions of jobs had been lost. That was the balance we had to strike. As I say, overwhelmingly it has been a success, and the fact that we have got unemployment 2 million lower than was forecast in 2020 is a signal of that success. But as I say, anyone who's taken money fraudulently will be pursued by HMRC, and we have a £100 million task force with over 1,000 staff set up precisely for that purpose.
And lastly on this, on the start-up schemes, you'll be aware that the Treasury has sunk millions of pounds into an online betting company. How comfortable are you with that?
Well, we support businesses across a range of economic sectors, and look, we are always clear that
You're happy to put
gambling
money
needs
into
to be-
online betting?
Look, the gambling sector needs to be properly regulated, and that's something we keep under very close review. I don't know the specific
It's
details of
called
the company to which you're...
BetConnect, an online betting
Right,
exchange. It wants to be, quotes, the next Betfair.
Yeah, well, I genuinely don't know about the specific circumstances of BetConnect, but we gave support to legally established British businesses, and obviously those are British businesses supporting UK jobs. Any company engaged in the gambling sector does need to be properly licensed.
And just I'll ask a couple of things. How happy do you suppose the good folk of Middlesbrough are, knowing that their tax money is going to support Bolton Wanderers?
Well, actually, people in Middlesbrough, I mean, we nearly lost our football club in 1986, so we have a lot of empathy with so am I.
But why am I supporting
we have a lot of
Bolton
empathy,
Wanderers?
genuinely, though. Bolton Wanderers, football clubs who've gone to the brink, they are huge cultural
Well,
institutions.
so
They're
you'll
also
bail out
big-
Derby then, will you?
Well, no. Well, we're
Well, hang
not
on. Why
talking
would
about
you
doing
bail
that.
out
They-
Bolton, but you won't bail out Derby?
Well, we're not. We didn't. We're not. I don't think we bailed out
Not
Bolton's
bail out,
debts.
but,
We-
here we go.
they may have. They may have. They may
A
have
£5
drawn down
million
support from the COVID
convertible
scheme.
loan from the Future Fund was made available to Bolton Wanderers. I bet Derby County would give a player to get a £5 million quid, so they can just give a phone call and get £5 million quid, can they?
Any support that's given to any business under our wider COVID support measures or otherwise is on its own merits, and I would defend obviously supporting football clubs wherever possible. They are massive community institutions, and
I'm sure
we're working, for example, in Bury now to make sure that football club has a future. And my colleague James Daly has been fantastic as the local MP and advocating for that. We all want football clubs to survive what has been a nightmare period for them.
Of course, lastly and briefly, you sit at the top table. Are we about to have a change as regards the NHS mandatory jab policy, Chief Secretary? Will staff not need to have the jab, Mr. Clarke?
This is something we keep under very, very close review. The reality is that we introduced this measure to protect both the NHS and the public from the consequences of people who aren't vaccinated, who are more likely, therefore, to get COVID and to infect others. We did that against the backdrop of the Delta variant being dominant last autumn. That has now switched, as we know, to the Omicron variant now, which is more transmissible but less dangerous. I can't genuinely prejudge whatever decision is made today, but what I would say is that obviously we will reflect that new reality in any decision that's made, and that's the right thing, the proportionate thing to do, I think.
I'm grateful for your time. Thank you. Conservative MP and Simon Clarke, Chief Secretary of the Treasury, appearing here on LBC, where it's 3 minutes after 8 news is next.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, mandatory COVID vaccines for health workers in England are reportedly going to be scrapped.